May 1967. Somewhere in the dense jungle west of Hill 55, South Vietnam. The air hung thick and motionless, a suffocating blanket of humidity that made every breath feel like drowning. Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock lay completely still in the elephant grass, his Winchester Model 70 rifle pressed against his shoulder, his eye fixed to the unertl 8X scope. He'd been in this exact position for 3 hours, hadn't moved, hadn't scratched the mosquito feeding on his neck, hadn't blinked more than absolutely necessary, because somewhere out there, in this ocean of green, another sniper was hunting him. The morning had started with a patrol from 1st Battalion, 26th Marines stumbling back to base carrying 2 dead and 3 wounded. Same story they'd been hearing all week. Single shots, high accuracy, always from impossible distances, always from positions nobody could locate. The Marine Corps had a problem, and that problem wore black pajamas and carried a rifle with a telescopic sight. Hathcock had volunteered immediately. This was his job, his calling, really. At 24 years old, he was already legendary among Marine snipers with 93 confirmed kills and a reputation that made NVA commanders put a bounty on his head. $30,000, the price of a house back in Arkansas. They called him Long Trang, White Feather, for the feather he wore in his bush hat. A taunt, a challenge, come and get me. But today he wasn't hunting, not exactly. Today he was bait. His spotter, Corporal John Burke, lay 3 feet to his left, scanning the tree line through binoculars. 22 years old from Pittsburgh, with hands steady enough to direct artillery fire and eyes sharp enough to spot a tripwire in tall grass. They'd worked together for 8 months, long enough to communicate with glances and hand signals, long enough to trust each other with their lives. Movement, Burke whispered, so quiet the word barely existed. 200 meters. 11 o'clock. Hathcock's eye never left his scope. He shifted his aim gradually, a millimeter at a time, tracking to where Burke had indicated. The jungle was a wall of green chaos, ferns, vines, palm fronds, bamboo thickets. 1,000,000 places to hide, 1,000,000 places to die. Then he saw it. Not movement exactly, something else. A shape that didn't belong, a gap in the foliage that suggested human geometry. The enemy sniper had been stalking them for 4 days now. 4 days of cat and mouse through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The NVA marksman was patient, disciplined, and lethal. 3 Marines dead, 7 wounded, all shot at ranges exceeding 400 meters. This wasn't some guerrilla with an old Mosin Nagant. This was a professional, a hunter who knew his craft. Hathcock had studied the kill patterns, examined the wound channels, calculated the angles. Whoever this shooter was, he had training. Soviet training, probably. The kind of training that turned soldiers into phantoms, the kind that made them invisible until the exact moment they decided to kill you. The sun climbed higher, turning the jungle into a steam bath. Sweat ran down Hathcock's face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't move to wipe it away. Movement was death. Movement was how you told the jungle you were there. He'd learned that in his first month in country, learned it from watching other snipers get killed because they got impatient, because they shifted their weight or adjusted their position at the wrong moment. Burke's breathing was the only sound, slow, controlled. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The rhythm of a man who'd learned to make himself invisible. The enemy was out there. Hathcock could feel it, the way you feel eyes on you in a dark room. That animal instinct, that evolution carved into human DNA over millions of years. The prey's knowledge that the predator is near. He scanned the tree line again. Slower this time, looking for what didn't fit. A leaf moving against the wind, a shadow too dark, a straight line in a world of curves. And then, for just a fraction of a second, he saw it. A glint. The glint vanished before Hathcock could even process what he'd seen. A flash of light, there and gone, like a fish turning in dark water. But it was enough. His pulse didn't quicken. He wouldn't allow that, but something shifted in his mind, the hunter's recognition that the game had changed. "Did you see that?" Burke's whisper was barely audible. "Yeah." Hathcock kept his eye pressed to the scope, his finger resting along the trigger guard. Not on the trigger, not yet. Scope reflection, maybe 300 meters, in the palms. 300 meters. Close enough to be deadly, far enough to miss if you rushed the shot. The intelligence reports had called him the Cobra. Nobody knew his real name, but the NVA soldiers who'd seen him work spoke of him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for spirits He moved through the jungle without sound, he killed without mercy. And he never, ever missed twice. 5 confirmed kills in 3 weeks, all Marines, all headshots. The last one had been a lieutenant from Alpha Company, shot through the temple while examining a map. The round had come from somewhere in the hills, somewhere impossible, and by the time the Marines organized a response, the Cobra had vanished like smoke. But he'd made a mistake. He'd developed a pattern. All his kills happened in the same grid square, all within a 5-kilometer radius of Hill 55. He had a territory, a hunting ground, and he was getting comfortable. Comfortable meant predictable. Predictable meant vulnerable. Hathcock had studied everything they knew about him, the trajectories, the timing, the locations. He'd overlaid the kill sites on a map and found the pattern, a rough circle with a dense bamboo thicket at its center. That's where the Cobra lived. That's where he returned after each kill. So Hathcock had done something crazy. He'd walked into the center of that circle and set himself up as bait. No backup, no quick extraction, just him and Burke and a rifle, waiting for one of the most dangerous men in I Corps to find them. Command had called it suicide. His lieutenant had refused to authorize it, so Hathcock had filed the paperwork as a reconnaissance patrol and walked into the jungle anyway. Because that's what you did when Marines were dying. That's what you did when you were the best. The minutes crawled past. The sun hammered down through breaks in the canopy, turning patches of jungle floor into ovens. A bird called somewhere to the north, a harsh, repetitive screech that set Hathcock's teeth on edge. But he didn't move, didn't shift, became part of the earth beneath him. Burke was studying the tree line through his binoculars, glassing every shadow, every gap in the foliage. "I've got nothing," he breathed. "He's gone to ground." "He's there." Hathcock's voice was absolute certainty. "He knows we're here. He's waiting for us to move." It was the oldest game in the sniper's handbook. Patience versus patience. Stillness versus stillness. Whoever moved first died first. The jungle became a chessboard where both players had their hands frozen above the pieces, each waiting for the other to commit. Hathcock's mind drifted back to the briefing, to the photographs of the Cobra's victims, clean kills, everyone, professional work. The kind of shooting that came from thousands of hours behind a rifle, from training that went beyond marksmanship into something closer to meditation. The Soviets taught their snipers to become one with their weapon, to breathe with it, to make the rifle an extension of their body. This man, whoever he was, had learned those lessons well. The intelligence officer had shown them one other thing, a photograph recovered from a captured NVA soldier. It showed a sniper rifle, Chinese-made, with a PU scope mounted on top. But it was what the soldier had said about it that made Hathcock pay attention. He'd called it the rifle that never misses, said its owner had been trained in the Soviet Union, that he'd killed American soldiers in the Korean War before coming to Vietnam. If that was true, the Cobra had 15 years of experience, 15 years of killing. That made him more than dangerous. That made him legendary. Hathcock shifted his aim slowly, scanning the area where he'd seen the glint. The palms were thick there, creating a natural hide, perfect concealment, perfect position. If he were setting up a counter-sniper ambush, that's exactly where he'd be. His heart rate was 60 beats per minute, resting pulse, the sign of a man in complete control. He'd trained himself to do this, to slow his body down, to become almost corpse-like in his stillness. It conserved energy. It reduced movement. It made you invisible. Burke had stopped glassing and was now perfectly motionless beside him, his breathing so shallow it barely disturbed the air. They'd become part of the landscape, 2 more shadows in a world made of shadows. The sun continued its arc across the sky. Noon came and went. The heat built to something almost unbearable, but Hathcock didn't notice anymore. He'd gone somewhere else in his mind, to that place where time stopped mattering, where discomfort became irrelevant, where nothing existed except the shot. And then he saw it again. The glint. Stronger this time, a clear reflection of sunlight off glass. And in that instant, Hathcock understood. The Cobra wasn't hiding anymore, he was hunting. He was looking directly at them through his scope, trying to acquire his target, which meant the Cobra's eye was pressed against that scope, which meant the Cobra was looking down a tube straight at Hathcock. And in that tube, in that narrow channel of glass and metal, there was only one path the bullet could travel. Hathcock's finger moved to the trigger. Time collapsed into a single moment of crystalline clarity. The glint held steady now, a pinpoint of light in the green chaos. Hathcock's breathing slowed even further. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. His heart beat once, twice. Each pulse sent a tiny tremor through his body, a microscopic movement that could throw off a long-range shot by inches. He had to time it, had to fire between heartbeats. Burke saw it too. Hathcock could sense his spotter's tension. The way his breathing changed became more controlled. They both understood what that glint meant. Scope glass catching sunlight, which meant a rifle, which meant the Cobra had found them. The question was, who would shoot first? Hathcock's crosshairs settled on the glint, 300 meters, give or take. No wind to speak of. The air hung dead and heavy in the jungle heat. Humidity would slow the bullet slightly, drop it maybe half an inch at this range. The .30-06 round in his Winchester would be traveling at roughly 2,400 feet per second when it reached the target. But the target wasn't a man. Not exactly. The target was a circle of glass maybe 40 millimeters wide, mounted on a rifle, behind which was a human eye. And behind that eye was a skull, and inside that skull was a brain that was, at this exact moment, calculating the exact same shot in reverse. The physics of it were insane. Impossible, really. For Hathcock's bullet to travel through the Cobra's scope, it would have to enter the objective lens, the front glass, at the exact angle that the scope was pointed. Any deviation, even a fraction of a degree, and the bullet would strike the metal housing and deflect. The margin of error was essentially zero. But there was something else, something that made the shot theoretically possible, even if it remained practically insane. If the Cobra was looking through his scope at Hathcock, then the scope was aimed directly at Hathcock, which meant the tube of the scope, that narrow channel from objective lens to ocular lens, was perfectly aligned with the path Hathcock's bullet would travel. It was a straight line, a tunnel through space, a geometry problem with human lives as variables. Hathcock's mind performed the calculations automatically, the product of 10,000 hours of training. Distance, 300 meters. Elevation, minimal, maybe 5 feet difference. Humidity, high, compensate down slightly. Target size, impossibly small. Probability of success near zero. Probability of survival if he didn't take the shot, also near zero. "That's him," Burke whispered, so quiet Hathcock almost didn't hear it. "You have the shot?" "Yeah." Hathcock's voice was steady, calm, the voice of a man discussing the weather. "I have it." What he didn't say was that having the shot and making the shot were two different things. He'd never attempted anything like this. Didn't know anyone who had. It violated every principle of practical marksmanship. You aimed for center mass. You aimed for the largest target. You gave yourself margin for error. This had no margin. The glint remained steady. The Cobra was settling in, taking his time, doing exactly what Hathcock was doing, controlling his breathing, timing his heartbeat, waiting for the perfect moment. Hathcock wondered what the man looked like. Was he young? Old? Did he have a family? Had he really fought in Korea, killed Americans on frozen hills 15 years ago? Did he wear the white feather too? Some equivalent symbol that told the world he was death incarnate? It didn't matter. In this moment, the Cobra wasn't a person. He was a target, a problem to be solved, a threat to be eliminated. Hathcock's finger rested on the trigger. 5 pounds of pressure would fire the rifle. 5 pounds stood between life and death, his and the Cobra's. Both of them knew it. Both of them were prepared for it. The jungle held its breath. The birds had stopped calling. Even the insects seemed to sense that something fundamental was about to happen. Some shift in the natural order that would leave the world slightly different than it had been. Hathcock exhaled slowly, emptying his lungs. This was the moment, the space between heartbeats, the pause between existence and non-existence. His crosshairs were steady on the glint that meant a scope, the scope that meant a rifle, the rifle that meant a man who was, right now, looking at Hathcock through that same piece of glass. 2 snipers, 2 rifles, 2 scopes, all aligned on a single geometric plane, 1 bullet. The mathematics of it were elegant in their simplicity. If the scopes were truly aligned, And they had to be, because that's what the glint meant. Then Hathcock's bullet would travel through the objective lens, through the tube, through the ocular lens, and into the Cobra's eye socket. If his aim was perfect, if his timing was perfect, if the scope was truly aligned and not slightly off axis, if the glass didn't deflect the round, if the bullet didn't tumble after passing through the first lens, if 100 other variables all aligned in his favor, if Hathcock's heart beat. Once. He waited. Let it settle. His finger increased pressure on the trigger. 3 pounds. 4. The trigger was about to break, and then the Cobra made his mistake. The glint brightened, just slightly, a fractional adjustment. The enemy sniper was refining his aim, making that final microscopic correction before he fired, which meant he was committed, which meant his eye was pressed tight against the ocular lens, which meant he was about to shoot. Hathcock squeezed through the trigger brake. The Winchester roared. The recoil slammed into Hathcock's shoulder, driving him back a fraction of an inch. The sound of the shot cracked through the jungle like thunder, shattering the oppressive silence, sending birds exploding from the canopy in a chaos of wings and panicked calls. But Hathcock didn't hear any of that. His eye was still pressed to his scope, watching, waiting for the result of an equation that shouldn't have been possible. For a fraction of a second, less than the time it takes to blink, nothing happened. The bullet traveled through 300 meters of humid air at 2,400 feet per second, dropping slightly as gravity pulled it down, angling toward that pinpoint of reflected light that marked the Cobra's position. Then the glint disappeared. Not gradually, not with the slow fade of someone moving away. It vanished instantly, absolutely, like someone had switched off a light. Hit, Burke breathed. Jesus Christ, that's a hit. Hathcock didn't move, didn't celebrate, didn't even blink. He kept his eye to the scope, scanning the area where the glint had been, looking for movement, looking for any sign that the Cobra was still in the fight, because good snipers didn't die easy. Good snipers had backup plans. Good snipers played dead and waited for you to come confirm the kill. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Nothing moved in the palms. "Cover me," Hathcock said. He rose slowly, his rifle still shouldered, still aimed at the target area. Every muscle in his body screamed from the hours of motionless waiting, but he ignored it. Burke stayed prone, his own rifle tracking beside Hathcock as they began the slow, methodical advance toward the Cobra's position. 300 meters became 200, then 100. The palms grew thicker, the undergrowth denser. Perfect ambush territory, perfect kill zone. If the Cobra was playing possum, this is where he'd spring the trap. But nothing happened. At 50 meters, Hathcock could see the position clearly. A natural depression in the earth, fortified with cut palm fronds with a clear field of fire toward the area where they'd been lying, a professional hide, the kind that took hours to build and left no trace from any angle except the one the Cobra had been watching. At 20 meters, Hathcock saw the rifle, a Chinese Type 53 Mosin Nagant, the standard-issue sniper rifle for NVA marksmen, long barrel, wooden stock, and mounted on top a PU 3.5x telescopic sight. The rifle was still in firing position, still propped on a rest of sandbags and bamboo, still aimed at the exact spot where Hathcock had been lying. The stock was covered in blood. Hathcock approached from the side, his Winchester trained on the position, his finger on the trigger. Burke flanked right, covering the blind spots, ready to fire if this was a trap. It wasn't a trap. The Cobra lay sprawled behind his rifle, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his right arm still extended toward the trigger. He was maybe 30 years old, Hathcock thought. Maybe younger. Hard to tell. He wore the standard black pajamas of the Viet Cong, but his equipment was better. Good boots, a proper web belt, a canvas pack that looked Soviet-made. And his face was gone. Not all of it, but enough. The bullet had entered through the ocular lens of his scope, the eyepiece, and traveled through his eye socket into his brain. The entry wound was small, almost surgical in its precision. The exit wound was considerably larger. Burke came up beside Hathcock, his rifle still raised, still ready. He looked at the Cobra's body, then at the rifle, then at the scope. "Holy shit," he whispered. Hathcock knelt beside the rifle, careful not to disturb anything. The Chinese scope was destroyed. The ocular lens, the lens the Cobra had been looking through, was shattered, blown out from the inside. But the objective lens, the front glass, had a hole in it, a perfect circle, slightly larger than .30 caliber where Hathcock's bullet had punched through. The physics of what had happened hit Hathcock all at once. His bullet had entered the objective lens at the exact angle of the scope's alignment. It had traveled through the scope tube, a channel maybe an inch wide and 6 inches long, without touching the sides. It had passed through the internal lenses, the adjustment mechanisms, the crosshair assembly, and it had exited through the ocular lens directly into the Cobra's eye. The odds of it were astronomical. The margin of error was measured in millimeters. If the Cobra's scope had been off-axis by even a degree, the bullet would have struck metal and deflected. If Hathcock's aim had been off by half an inch at the muzzle, it would have missed the lens entirely. But it hadn't missed. Burke was examining the Cobra's equipment, pulling items from his pack, a notebook, a map, a photograph of a woman and 2 children, a medal, Soviet-made probably from the Korean War, and a piece of paper folded carefully with writing in Vietnamese. "What's it say?" Hathcock asked. Burke shook his head. "I don't read Vietnamese, but look at this." He held up the medal. "You were right. He was in Korea." Hathcock picked up the rifle, careful to clear the chamber first. There was a round in it, unfired. The Cobra had been seconds, maybe less, from taking his shot when Hathcock's bullet found him. Seconds. If Hathcock had waited another heartbeat, if he'd second-guessed the shot, if he'd hesitated for even a fraction of a second, the Cobra's bullet would have been in the air. And Hathcock would be the one lying dead in the elephant grass, his face blown out, his war over. The thought didn't scare him. Fear wasn't useful, but it focused him, reminded him why he was here, why he did what he did. The margin between life and death was razor thin. The difference between going home and being shipped home in a box was measured in milliseconds and millimeters. "We need to get back," Burke said, "before his friends show up." Hathcock nodded. He took the Cobra's rifle and scope as evidence, left the rest. The body would be found eventually, probably by NVA soldiers, and they would see what had happened. They would see the destroyed scope. They would understand that one of their best had been killed by a shot that shouldn't have been possible. And they would know who had made that shot. Because word traveled fast in the jungle. Because snipers talked. Because the White Feather's reputation would grow with every impossible kill. The walk back to Hill 55 took 3 hours. They moved carefully, watching for ambushes, stopping every 100 meters to listen. But the jungle was empty. Whatever NVA forces were in the area had melted away, probably spooked by the sound of the shot, probably assuming that American forces were conducting a sweep. When they reached the perimeter, the Marines on watch stared at them like they'd seen ghosts. Word had spread that Hathcock and Burke had gone into the Cobra's territory. Most people assumed they'd never come back. Hathcock handed the Cobra's rifle to the intelligence officer, explained what had happened, and filed his report. 94 confirmed kills. Then he went back to his hooch, cleaned his rifle, and tried not to think about the photograph of the woman and 2 children. The story spread through I-Corps like wildfire. At first, nobody believed it. A bullet through an enemy scope? Impossible. Had to be exaggeration, had to be the kind of war story that grew in the telling, the way fish got bigger and enemy forces multiplied with every retelling over warm beer. But then the intelligence officer showed them the evidence, the Chinese rifle with its shattered scope, the hole in the objective lens, the blood and tissue still coating the ocular end, and the photographs, clear, undeniable photographs that showed exactly what had happened. The shot was real. Within a week, every sniper in Vietnam had heard about it. Within 2 weeks, it had reached the training schools back in the States. Within a month, it was being analyzed by Soviet military advisors in Hanoi, who studied the evidence and tried to understand how their carefully trained marksmen had been killed by something that shouldn't have been possible. The mathematics were simple enough. If 2 scopes were perfectly aligned, then theoretically a bullet could travel through one and into the other. But theory and practice were separated by a canyon of variables: wind, humidity, minute variations in ammunition, the inherent instability of a rifle bullet traveling through glass, the fact that both snipers would have to be aimed at each other at the exact same instant. The odds, one ballistics expert later calculated, were something like 1 in a million. But Hathcock had made the shot. The NVA response was immediate and telling. Within days of the Cobra's death, sniper activity in the Hill 55 area dropped to almost nothing. The marksmen who had been terrorizing Marine patrols simply vanished. Some rotated to other sectors. Others became more cautious, taking fewer risks, avoiding engagements unless they had overwhelming advantage. Because they understood something fundamental. If the white feather could make that shot, then no position was safe. No hide was secure. Distance didn't matter. Cover didn't matter. If Carlos Hathcock could see you, he could kill you, even through your own scope. The psychological impact was devastating. NVA snipers began covering their scopes with cloth when moving between positions. They stopped using the glint from their glass to acquire targets. They became paranoid about reflections, about anything that might give away their position to American counter-snipers. The $30,000 bounty on Hathcock's head grew to $50,000, $80,000. Eventually, there were rumors it had reached $100,000, more money than most Vietnamese would see in 10 lifetimes. The NVA wanted him dead that badly. The white feather had become more than a sniper. He'd become a symbol, a ghost story, the boogeyman who lived in the jungle and killed the unkillable. But among American forces, the reaction was different. Hathcock became a legend. Young snipers studied his techniques, tried to emulate his patience, his discipline, his absolute commitment to the craft. The shot through the Cobra's scope became the standard against which all other sniper kills were measured. It was the impossible made real, proof that skill and nerve could overcome any odds. Hathcock himself was characteristically modest about it. When asked about the shot, he'd shrug and say he got lucky. That the Cobra had made the mistake of catching sunlight on his scope. That the conditions had been perfect and the geometry had aligned and he'd just squeezed the trigger at the right moment. But Burke knew better. He'd been there. He'd watched Hathcock make 1,000 calculations in a split second, seen him commit to a shot that any sane person would have refused, watched him execute with a precision that bordered on supernatural. It wasn't luck, Burke told anyone who'd listen. It was the best shooting I've ever seen, will ever see. The military tried to classify the incident, worried that if the technique became widely known, enemy snipers would start attempting similar shots. But the story was already out, already spreading through the ranks, already becoming part of Marine Corps lore. By the end of 1967, Carlos Hathcock had 93 confirmed kills. The number wouldn't reach its final total of 93 until much later, as some kills remained unconfirmed until after the war. But the shot that mattered, the one that changed everything, was number 94, the Cobra, the impossible shot. It changed sniper doctrine on both sides of the war. American forces began training their marksmen specifically in counter-sniper techniques, teaching them to look for scope glint, to understand the geometry of aligned optics, to take shots that previous generations would have considered impossible. The idea that you could shoot through an enemy's scope while still improbable became an accepted part of the tactical playbook. For the NVA and Viet Cong, the lesson was more brutal. American snipers had reached a level of skill that made traditional tactics obsolete. The careful stalking, the patient positioning, the methodical hunting that had made snipers like the Cobra so effective, all of it could be countered by someone with enough skill and nerve to take a shot measured in millimeters. The Chinese Type 53 rifle with its destroyed scope ended up in a Marine Corps museum, a silent testament to the shot that shouldn't have happened. Visitors stare at the hole in the objective lens, at the shattered ocular glass, and try to imagine the moment, the geometry, the precision, the absolute ice-cold nerve it took to aim at a tiny circle of glass 300 meters away and pull the trigger. Most can't comprehend it. The human mind struggles with that level of precision, that degree of skill. It seems like something from a movie, from a tall tale, from the kind of story that grows in the telling. But it happened. May 1967. In the jungle west of Hill 55. 2 snipers, 2 rifles, 2 scopes, aligned on a single geometric plane. And one shot that traveled through glass and metal and into legend. Carlos Hathcock returned home in 1969, after his 1-year extension ended. He'd been burned over most of his body pulling 7 Marines from a burning vehicle, an act of heroism that earned him a Silver Star but ended his career as a field sniper. He spent the rest of his service teaching at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School in Quantico, passing on his knowledge to a new generation of marksmen. He died in 1999, at age 56, complications from multiple sclerosis. By then, the stories about him had taken on an almost mythical quality. The crawl through the jungle that took 4 days, the 1,600-meter shot that killed an NVA general, The time he held off an entire NVA company by himself. But of all the stories, all the confirmed kills, all the impossible shots, one stands above the rest: the shot through the Cobra's scope. The shot that proved that, in the hands of a true master, the rifle becomes something more than a weapon. It becomes an extension of will, a tool of absolute precision, a way to impose order on chaos. The legend of that shot lives on in every sniper school, every marksmanship course, every late-night conversation between shooters who understand what it means. Not just the technical skill, not just the steady hand and the calm heart, but the willingness to take a shot that everyone said was impossible. The courage to squeeze the trigger when the margin of error is zero. The absolute, unshakable belief that you can make the shot that changes everything. That's Carlos Hathcock's real legacy. Not the numbers, not the confirmed kills, not even the legendary shot through the Cobra's scope. It's the idea that the impossible is just another target. And with enough skill, enough patience, enough discipline, you can hit anything